Hi, my name is Michael Joyce, and I'm a wildlife ecologist with the Natural Resources Research Institute. I'd like to thank the Minnesota Forest Resources Partnership for asking me to give this presentation on an ongoing study that I'm leading. And so today I'm going to be talking to you guys about the Minnesota Fisher Den Box project, including some background and the reason for the project. I will tell you our objectives, and then finally I'll go through some of our preliminary results. Okay, so before we move on to just talking about fishers, I do want to just take a moment to point out that cavities are important for a lot more than just fishers. In fact, there's a lot of wildlife species that depend on cavities for at least part of their natural history requirements. And because of the wide range of species that depend on cavities, they're generally considered a keystone habitat resource in forests. Often, cavities provide a place for adults to rest, a place that's secure and protective from both predators and from the weather. And in a lot of situations, they actually also provide that sort of secure, protective environment for a female and for her young. And because of that, in some cases, cavities are a really critical part of successful reproduction and population recruitment. All right, so clearly cavities are really important for wildlife, but of concern over the last few decades, there have been a number of studies that have pointed towards this global decline in the availability of large trees with cavities. So you think about a forest, in order to maintain cavities in that forest at the density that they currently exist, or maybe that they historically existed, you need to balance out the loss of cavities with the rate of formation. So if you're losing more than you're forming, you're going to have a decline in cavities. Whereas if you're gaining more than you're losing, then you're going to have an increase in abundance. So what's going on with this global decline in cavity availability? Well, first of all, cavity trees take many, many years to form. And there's been a number of studies that have looked at this for different species. And so although they take a long time to form, they can be lost really quickly, whether that be from natural senescence, from natural disturbances, or from forest management. And in a lot of managed landscapes, one thing that can influence the supply of cavity trees is harvest rotations. And so in general, cavity trees take a lot longer to develop relative to harvest rotations. And so ultimately where you're rotating stands at the economic harvest rotation, you may also be keeping them from forming cavities once they're lost after an initial harvest. And so generally, because of harvest rotations generally being shorter, there have been a number of studies that have shown cavity abundance being lower in managed landscapes than in unmanaged landscapes, although obviously this depends a lot on the tree species and the management regime. But nonetheless, there is a lot of concern, not just for fishers, but for a lot of cavity-dependent wildlife in these kind of longer-term, large-scale trends in cavity availability. So one of the reasons that we're really concerned about fishers in Minnesota right now is that population monitoring data collected by the DNR shows that the fisher population has declined by 50% over the last 20 years. So this graph on the slide shows that data. In black, the black line is the DNR's population model showing fall population size, so before the fur trapping season. And the red line is a winter track index. And so it is important to point out that these are two completely independent measures of the abundance of fishers that show really the same overall pattern here. We do more recently, showing in yellow here, see some sign that our decline in our population has stabilized, and our population may even be starting to go up. Part of the reason there is that we've had really low levels of harvest the last few years. But we have seen the same sort of trend before where we see a little stabilization or uptick. So we do need to follow this population for longer to see what's going on. But that is really encouraging. Another important thing that I'd like to point out, though, is that we are not at a critical level with this population. We still have about 8,000 animals. And so there are places where fishers are doing much worse. For example, fishers are just listed as of today while I'm recording this presentation. They're just added to the threatened and endangered species list as a threatened species. That is for the South Sierra fisher population segment in California. And so we're not at the point where we are worried about that fishers being listed here in Minnesota, but we also really don't want them to get to that point. So it's really important right now that we take some time to figure out what's going on here so that we can keep things from getting that bad. As a wildlife biologist, a lot of my interest in conserving fishers is their ecological and cultural importance in this region. But they're also a species that, if they're not doing well, it's not good business for forest industries. So adding fishers to the threatened and endangered species list adds a lot of administrative burden and regulatory burden to the forest management planning process. So in response to the population decline, the Minnesota DNR conducted a research project from 2008 to 2015. During that project, which was led by John Erb, they captured and radio collared 114 fishers, and these fishers were relocated about every week from a plane. And there was a lot of other data that was collected at the same time. So data on home range size, habitat use, diet, reproduction, and survival. And so really the goal of this project was partly to respond to the population decline, but also just to update what we know about fishers in Minnesota and update the information that feeds into the population model. So although that DNR study's main purpose was not to look at the causes of the fisher decline, the data they collected certainly shed some light on potential causes of the fisher decline. And so there's really kind of three things that we talk about a lot. One being potential harvest levels or over harvest during the first season. Two, predation, specifically high rates of female fishers getting killed by predators, especially bobcats. And then habitat loss. And so all of these things may have played a role in the observed dynamics of the population that we've seen. But today I'm really going to focus on habitat loss. And really, under the larger umbrella of habitat loss, I'm only really going to focus on concerns about cavity trees that support female fisher reproduction. But that's not to say that we're discounting these other factors. We are involved in several other research projects trying to take a more comprehensive look at some of these potential causes. And the Fisher Den Box project is one of the projects in the areas that we're looking at. Okay, but before I totally abandon talking about other causes of the fisher population decline, I do just want to point out that obviously there could be some interactions between some of these factors. And one area that we especially think there might be an interaction is den availability and predation by bobcats. And so here's an example, a set of pictures from the DNR project. On the left is a female fisher coming back to her reproductive den cavity, which is the big tree you see in the background. So on the left, she's coming in about 2:45 in the morning. And on the right, several hours later, here's a bobcat coming by. And this was not an isolated observation. During that project, there were quite a few observations of bobcats showing up at fisher reproductive dens. In some cases, those females would later get killed by bobcats. And so, again, this is just one more chance for me to say we are not just looking at one factor with this decline, and there may be some complex things going on that we hope to tease out in the future. So I've already mentioned that fishers need cavity trees and fishers use cavity trees as reproductive dens, but I'd like to take kind of a break and just kind of go through how fishers use cavities and what reproductive dens are. So first, both male and female fishers use cavity trees as rest sites throughout the year, especially in the winter. So a nice cavity tree in the winter can provide a warm place for fishers to rest on, especially on really cold days. But with the Den Box project and with our concern about cavity availability, we're really focused more on reproduction and how female fishers use cavity trees. And so a reproductive den is the structure where a fisher will give birth to her kits and where she'll keep them in a protected area while she cares for them and raises them before they become independent. And in Minnesota, this data is from Minnesota, but also elsewhere, fishers almost exclusively use tree cavities as reproductive dens. So here in Minnesota, 96% of our reproductive dens were in cavity trees. It was about a 2-to-1 ratio of cavities in living trees to cavities in snags. But as the kits mature and they move around more, they do sometimes use hollow logs later in the season. And so this is not just a pattern we see in Minnesota. In fact, out of the over 1,000 reproductive dens that have been found throughout North America, almost 99% of the time fishers are using tree cavities. So it is a resource that they really do appear to need. And because it provides us protection and helps them successfully raise their kits, it is a really critical part of successful reproduction for them. So fishers need tree cavities, but what tree species do fishers use here in Minnesota? So where we've studied female fisher reproductive den selection in Minnesota, they most of the time are using cavities in aspen trees. So about 2/3 of the cavities that we've found them using for reproductive dens have been in aspens. But they also use a variety of other cavities in other species as well. So oak, pines, maples, cedar, basswood, and elm. And so we really think that to a fisher, it's a lot more important the characteristics of the cavity than it is the species of tree. So a female fisher, when she's selecting a reproductive den, she wants a tree cavity with an opening that is big enough that she can go in and out, but is small enough that it excludes larger bodied predators and even male fishers from being able to get in and harm her kits when she's not there. Because fishers are one of our bigger cavity dependent wildlife in Minnesota, they also need pretty big trees so that the cavity chamber itself is big enough that the female fisher and her kits can fit in there. And so you can imagine as the litter grows, she needs slightly more space. Okay, so I would like to just briefly revisit some of the concerns about cavities that I mentioned earlier in the context of fishers. And so one of the things that we know about fishers, which I briefly mentioned on the last slide, is that they need pretty big trees with cavities in them to serve as reproductive dens. In Minnesota, the average tree used by a fisher was 20 inches in diameter. And from some pretty intensive vegetation sampling that we've done on this project, we find that less than 2% of trees in our study areas are 20 inches or greater. And obviously not all trees that big have a suitable cavity. And so, I do want to acknowledge that big trees with cavities are never going to be abundant at, say, 50% of the trees in the forest. But because they're naturally rare and perhaps even more rare in managed forests, we were concerned that they could become a limiting resource, especially because of the important role that they play in reproduction. And so not surprisingly, because the cavity trees used by fishers are among the largest trees on the landscape, they also tend to be among the oldest trees on the landscape. So they take a long time to develop. And so ultimately, if we need to maintain a constant supply of cavity trees for our fishers, we need to ensure that we're gaining cavity trees at least as fast as we're losing them. And so what data is there on how old these trees are? As it turns out, there's actually relatively few studies that have aged cavity trees used by fishers. There is some data from British Columbia, and we're now working on this in Minnesota. Part of the challenge with getting good data is that cavities might form before fishers actually use them. So our ages might slightly overestimate how long it takes for cavities to develop. But the other really big challenge is getting good age data on big old rotten trees. And I could spend probably 20 minutes just talking about some of the challenges we've experienced with that. Nonetheless, we do have some data. I do want to emphasize that our data is preliminary and represents a relatively small number of trees at this point, but we're going to continue to work on this. But generally, to put an age to it, when we're talking about aspen, there's a lot of agreement between the study in British Columbia, and our data here in Minnesota, that on average it takes about 90 to 95 years for an aspen tree to get big enough and form a heart rot chamber that a fisher can use. And the range is really about 80 to, say, 130 years. And so this seems like a long time, but how does this actually relate to the way we manage aspen in Minnesota? So if we're considering a fairly productive site index 70 aspen stand, our peak economic harvest would occur around 45 years. Extended harvest maybe out to about 67. So that more or less is our range of economic harvest. And the stand would break up around 91 years. So when you compare that to the ages of aspen cavity trees that fishers have used, you can see that where we're only taking an economic approach, we will not allow trees to get old enough to commonly create cavities that fishers can use. Now, there's a lot of steps that have already been taken by forest managers. Obviously, not all stands are harvested. Some stands do escape harvest rotation. Some stands are allowed to break up and move on to the next thing. And even where harvest occurs, there's things like leaf trees and retention patches that can be taken into account when setting up management to allow trees to escape this and get old enough to form cavities. But because of this is kind of where some of our concern comes in terms of the difference between how old the forest needs to get for economic forest management and how old it has to get for fisher habitat. So what about the other side of the spectrum? So once we have a cavity tree, how long does it last? Again, there's not a lot of data in literature answering this question. So this is something, again, we're very much still investigating. We're revisiting a lot of cavity trees as frequently as we can to see when they're lost and what causes them. And there is some data that's been published on fishers and martens, but it's quite variable. And so again, once we get a 20-inch aspen with a cavity in it, it's not there forever. So it does have a limited life. And we're still kind of in the process of fully understanding how tree species and whether it was living or dead and presence of windstorms and really deep, wet, heavy snows affect this. But again, in terms of our understanding of maintaining cavities, we need to really understand how long it takes for them to be developed and how quickly they're lost so that we can evaluate different management strategies in an effort to more effectively balance forest management and cavity formation. Okay, and so before I get on to talking about the Fisher Den Box project specifically, I do just want to point out that there are a lot of really important questions regarding fissures and cavities that we don't really have good answers for at this time. And some of these things we're continuing to look into. But for example, we don't have a good estimate of how many cavities there are in any landscape or in Minnesota as a whole. We don't have good data at the moment on whether or how cavity abundance has changed over time. And when it comes to fissures specifically, there's a lot that we don't know about how many cavities an individual fisher might need per year over their lifetime, how cavity availability influences territory establishment or size. And we really, despite our concerns, don't have direct information telling us whether or not cavities could be limiting resources for fishers. And so finding answers to these questions and continuing to dig into this is really a critical part of being able to have good conversations and making good strategic plans that would take cavity abundance into direct consideration when planning forest management. Which leaves us to the Minnesota Fisher Den Box study. So this is a study that I've been working on for almost 3 years. First, a few years as a pilot study, and then beginning about a year ago as a larger funded study. And so in general, our overall objective with this study is to evaluate Fisher Den Boxes as a potential habitat management tool for fishers. So a lot of our concerns that I expressed earlier, if we're really concerned about the number of cavities, one might expect then that if we can put up artificial cavities, that might be a way to enhance habitat for fishers while we're waiting for stands to get old enough to develop natural cavities. And so our study has really kind of 3 main goals. There are some smaller sub-objectives that I'm not going to talk about today. But the first goal is to determine what factors influence whether fishers and other wildlife are willing to use den boxes. So obviously, to be able to use this as a good habitat management tool, we need to understand where and when it's most likely to be successful. A second step is using our results to begin to evaluate whether cavities are a limiting resource for fishers. So we don't right now have the right setup in this study to be able to directly answer this question, but certainly the amount of use we get will help us further evaluate the likeliness that cavity limitation is an issue for our population here, and would provide the groundwork for future studies to address that question more directly. And then finally, based on the results of number 1 and 2, we are trying to develop instructions and management guidelines for fisher den boxes. So once we know whether or where they might be a good habitat management tool, we want to put together a formal guideline that people can use if they're interested in using den boxes in land that they manage or own. Okay, so this map shows our study area where we have boxes currently in north central and northeastern Minnesota. And so when we started a few years ago doing some pilot work for this project, we started initially by putting boxes near what we call our Hoyt Lake study area, which is this blue polygon in kind of the south central portion of the Superior National Forest. We put 9 boxes up there initially, and we also put a box down in Carleton County on lands managed by the Carleton County Land Department. And so that was the pilot study. When we first were planning on starting this larger study, the goal was to put 40 boxes in each of 2 study areas, so the Hoyt Lake study area, and then this study area down near Reamer, this pink polygon. And so this is a study area that overlaps the southern portion of the Chippewa National Forest and then state and county lands south of there. So when we were first starting, we were going to put up 80 boxes. That's all we were going to do. But one of the cool things about this project is since we've started and given some presentations and been in touch with various folks, we've really been able to expand on this initial plan to include more den boxes and kind of expand the different types of forests and different forest management where we're putting boxes, but also to expand the sample size and the spatial extent. And so after the initial pilot study, we put up more boxes in Carleton County with the Carleton County Land Department. We also put up 4 boxes in association with the Cloquet Forestry Center. This last winter, we put up 2 more boxes with the Hubachek Wilderness Research Center. We are in the process of working with the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe to put up 12 boxes in a study area overlapping the reservation. And then we're also working with Blandon to put up 12 boxes on their land holdings. And so the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe and the Blandon boxes are on hold, and they have been since the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, this has been a really cool opportunity to take a project that was originally going to have 80 boxes and work with various people to bring that total up to over 120 boxes. And so having the extra data is going to be really helpful to help us really address our objectives. I'm not going to go through a lot of details on our study design, but I do want to just give kind of an overview of how we're selecting sites to put boxes to help us address our objectives. So we're using what we're calling a clustered random sampling design. So what we do with each of our study areas is overlay a 16 square kilometer grid. That area, the grid cell area, corresponds to the average female fisher home range size in Minnesota. We randomly select a subset of the grids, and each grid that we select, grid cell I should say, gets 4 boxes. Half of these are put in high quality fisher habitat, and half of these are put in more moderate habitat. So areas that have a canopy, there's prey, but the trees are either not a species that forms cavities typically, or they're too young for there to be a lot of natural cavities. So it's through this design that we're able to really address our objective of what habitat types and what habitat conditions are needed for fishers to use the den boxes. Okay, so once we have the boxes up, we then obviously need to collect some data about what animals are using which boxes. And so what we're doing right now is effectively monitoring these boxes year round using 4 different methods that will provide the data we need to address our objectives. And so first method, remote cameras, we have a remote camera at each of our den boxes pointed at the opening. And so in theory, that will catch any animal that visits or uses each of our den boxes. In addition to that, we have a hair snare, which is a glue strip that goes on the top side of the opening of the box. And so as especially larger animals like fishers go in and out of the boxes, that glue strip grabs a little bit of hair, removes the hairs, and then we can identify who's been in there based on genetics or based on just the way that the hair looks. And so it might seem like these 2 methods are redundant, but remote cameras are not perfect at capturing animals going in and out of the boxes. And so having the 2 methods is really complementary. In addition, we have temperature loggers in all of our boxes. And I wish I had more time today to talk about this aspect of the project. There's a master's student named Taylor Vielander at the University of Minnesota Duluth who's working on this as part of his thesis. And he's really looking at predicting temperature inside of artificial den boxes or natural cavities based on ambient temperature. But in addition to that, having the temperature profile can really help us figure out if we do miss an animal going in or coming out. We can see the temperature profile respond to the heat generated by the animal and helps us get a better picture of how that box is being used. And then lastly, during the fisher breeding season, when females have kits, during our routine monitoring visits, we put an inspection camera, really just a GoPro on a selfie stick, into the opening of the box so that if there is a litter of kits, we can count the kits. And even if there isn't, it gives us good information about anything that we might otherwise be missing that's going on inside that box. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just finish up here by going through some preliminary results. We have been at this with a large number of boxes for less than a year. Currently, I'm going to summarize some data from 89 of our boxes, and we've collected an astonishing 970,000 pictures over the last 9 months for 80 of the boxes, and then another year for the other 9. But it's an incredible data set, but it's also really time consuming for us to go through and analyze those pictures. So the results I'm talking about today are only from about 23% of those pictures. I do want to say that we pretty much know if there's a fisher been in the box from the glue strip. So I'm not really missing those. It's just some of the other species data that we don't have fully summarized. So just a caveat up front, these are preliminary results. So the first interesting thing that we've seen is that we've had fishers detected at 16% of our boxes. That may seem low to some of you, but there is some data from British Columbia where a previous fisher den box study was conducted that showed that female use of den boxes for reproduction increases over time. So I'm pretty optimistic with the amount of use that we've seen. And I'll go through and show some examples of what that use looks like. But this early in the project, we're pretty happy. We will continue to monitor for at least another year, and hopefully we'll get funding to monitor for at least 5 total years. So this is actually one of our first den boxes we put up back in 2018, one of 4 boxes. And within a month of putting it up, we had this male fisher come visit it. He tried to stick his head in, he couldn't get in. So I mentioned earlier that natural cavities that fishers use for reproduction have an opening that excludes males. Well, we use that same design with our den boxes. So he couldn't get in, but a few days later, a female fisher showed up. She was able to get in. She spent some time in the box and then she left. So for a first year, this kind of use, this female came back a few times. We're pretty happy with that for 1 out of 4 boxes. All right, so then in our second winter, we put up 9 additional pilot boxes, but we continued to monitor the original 4. And in March 2019, we had this really cool interaction where we had a female fisher inside the box. There's a male fisher standing outside the box. This is during the fisher breeding season. And so this is a male fisher doing what male fishers do to ask if he might have an opportunity to mate. And if you can see up close here, the female fisher's teeth are bared, so it's an unequivocal no from her. But there's been some suggestion that female fishers might use natural cavities as a way to select mates because a male can't get in. And so it's pretty cool to see a similar sort of behavior going on in this box. And I do want to note that this particular stand is in Carlton County. It's, I believe, around 30-year-old red pine plantation. And so absent this den box, there's really no natural cavities. And so this is a cool example of putting up a den box and having this sort of interaction that is really unlikely to take place in this stand otherwise. Here's another example of a box that was visited by a fisher, a male in this case. So last fall, 2 red squirrels found this box, which is up in the Superior National Forest. They started packing in leaves and grass and other bedding material, as well as cones. Well, one night, a male fisher found the box. You can see the brave red squirrel peering out through the opening at the potential predator that's waiting to eat it. And so after a while, the squirrel obviously gets back into the box. The male tries in vain to get in. First, he tries to stick his head in, doesn't work. Then he tries to stick his arms in, still doesn't work. And so this is a really cool interaction. And we do think that fishers probably do some hunting in natural cavities, maybe not always for red squirrels, which can fit into a lot smaller cavity openings, but still a really cool observation to see. Here's another example from the Reamer study area in the Chippewa. Here's a female fisher. She went into our box. She slept for about 4 hours. Here she is after that, poking her head out. She comes out. She deposits a scat on the top of the box, which for humans would probably indicate that you weren't very happy with the accommodation. But for carnivores, and especially those in the weasel family, that actually is a good thing. It's a compliment. It means that she did like it. She then goes back in the box and sleeps for another 12 hours. Okay, one more example of a fisher at a den box in the Chippewa National Forest. So this box is being used a lot by gray squirrels, and this female fisher shows up one night, runs up the tree, comes back down with a gray squirrel. She dispatches it, leaves it on the box, goes inside to check out the box, must decide that it's not that bad, and then pulls the squirrel in. She does apparently come back later and eat it. And so again, these are interesting pictures, but kind of on a larger scale. They give us some optimism. A lot of these observations, other than being really neat to see, kind of show us examples of fishers finding the boxes and using them in similar ways that they use natural cavities. So we're really excited over the next few years to see how use patterns change with fishers, and just to continue to be able to get the data we need to address our objectives. We've seen a number of other species at the den boxes. So one of the other fairly common ones we see is martins. Sometimes they're just walking by. A lot of times they go in and check things out. We've had martins walking by with food in their mouth. We've also had flying squirrels at quite a few of our boxes. Again, a lot of times they're just running by. They're incidental, but we do often see them going inside. And we had one pair of flying squirrels late winter in the Chippewa National Forest that built this nest in one of our boxes. So you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, there's quite a pile of feces that they've left. They've shredded some of the bedding and made a nice little nest. Not surprisingly, we also see a lot of use by non-flying squirrels. We've had a lot of other kind of interesting things that we've seen. Again, more incidental to the box, not that they actually care or trying to use the box, but they see it and they're curious. So here's an example of a cow moose up in the Superior National Forest. She has a calf with her. They both kind of check out the box. I like to think they're admiring our handiwork, but probably just wondering why this weird box is out in the woods. We've also seen a number of boxes, a small number, where black bears come. We have some where they're actually sitting on top of the box, trying to chew on the box. Fortunately, we're using pretty high strength cable, but fortunately they haven't spent a lot of time trying to rip any of our boxes down yet or apart. It helps that we don't have any food in there for them. So kind of in summary of our data where we're at so far, this table shows the different species that we've seen. Again, I'd like to point out the caveat that this is preliminary data. We have a lot of pictures to go through. But generally what we're seeing is a lot of use by squirrels, a lot of situations where we see deer mice, peromyscus showing up at our boxes, and fewer, but still relatively frequent, seeing martins and fishers. So we really care about this project from the standpoint of providing habitat for fishers, but there's a lot of other species that could secondarily benefit from this project and that also need cavities. And so we are really interested also to understand more about cavity needs of some of these other species. And kind of a neat observation that shows use of a natural cavity by multiple species. The aspen tree with the cavity that you see in this picture was found during the DNR Fisher project. Fisher had her litter in that cavity back in March 2014. And back in February 2019, we went out to this cavity to put a temperature logger in it. And when we went out there was 2 flying squirrels using it. They popped out, we dropped our temp logger in, and they kind of went back in. Well, when we went back then about a year ago to retrieve our temperature logger, there was a saw-whet owl that was actually nesting in this tree, and as far as we can tell, stayed in there until she fledged her young. And so this is an interesting observation. I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on whether there's something special about this particular tree or its location that all 3 of these species used this cavity. But certainly it kind of gets at the point that there are a lot of wildlife in our state that need cavities. And so while we're looking at fishers, there's also a lot of interest in understanding cavity needs for some of these other species, and perhaps looking for opportunities to understand when certain cavities are extra valuable and they get used by multiple species. So just to end, again, what we want to know is, can den boxes be used as a habitat management tool, and specifically to help us balance fisher habitat needs with forest harvest? So it takes a long time after harvest for a natural cavity to form. Can we get that stand back to good habitat for fishers earlier by putting up den boxes? This is something we're taking a critical look at, but it's not the only part of a good habitat management strategy for fishers. In addition to considering den boxes, we think that additional steps could be taken to identify and conserve existing cavities, to think about harvesting in a way that we leave some trees to develop cavities in the future. This is so far all from a cavity perspective. We also need to think of other habitat needs of fishers and how we maintain connectivity on the landscape. I think this is a topic that there's a really good opportunity for a cross collaboration between forestry and wildlife personnel to really more thoroughly explore harvest strategies that both allow an economic function to our forest management, but also allow us to mitigate some potential mid and long-term impacts on fishers and other cavity-dependent species. So lastly, I'm not the only one working on this, so I'd just like to acknowledge the collaborators and students that are also working on this project. I've already mentioned by name many of our den box partners, but there's some others that are listed here. I would like to specifically thank Kirk Titus with Cass County, Jake Cordy with Minnesota DNR, and then a number of biologists with Superior and Chippewa National Forest who provided good information to help with my site selection process. Funding for some of the data I talked about today was provided by the Minnesota DNR and the Wildlife Restoration Act, and then the Den Box project itself is funded by the Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund as recommended by LCCMR. Thanks again for the opportunity to present this information to the Minnesota Forest Resource Partnership. If you have any questions, feel free to send them to Kathleen Priest. She'll get them to me. Additionally, my email address is on this slide, so feel free to reach out if you have any further questions. Thanks.